Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Every week I've been given by EWTN this privilege of introducing to you men and women who, because of their love for Christ, brought home to the Catholic Church. Sometimes that journey didn't begin with a love for Christ. It began searching for what is true, and then they find it in the Catholic Church. And this is a little different program tonight. I could call it an open line first Monday, but it isn't the first Monday. It's the middle of the month, but we have a returning guest. Great privilege of having Dr. William Oddie here. I'm sorry. Dr. William Oddie here. We interviewed him when we were in England, and that was a great experience. But it's great he's back in America for a particular reason. He's going to share it with you in a moment. But before I do that, I want to remind you that you are an essential aspect of our program, your questions, especially tonight. We'd like to start taking your phone calls and emails as soon as we can for Dr. Oddie. He is a former Anglican clergyman, converted to the church. He'll tell his story in a little bit, but we interviewed him when we were in England, so you may remember his story. He's an author, journalist, now a freelance writer. If you have a question for him, give us a call at 1-800-221-9460. Outside North America, England, give us a call, 205-271-2980, or you can send us an email at journeyhome@ewtn.com. Dr. Oddie, welcome to the Journey Home. It's good to have you here. It's good to see you again. It was a pleasure being with you in Newman's old haunts.
Yeah, Newman's Library.
That was a great experience to be there. I mean, what a unique place to be there to tell your story.
Yeah.
Now, you're here in America because you're involved with the Chesterton Conference. We'll save that a little bit.
Okay.
So I'll let the audience know that. Chesterton, you've written books. I think you wrote a book about feminist theology. You attacked that issue a couple years ago. Also about Anglican converts to the church. And you have a book that you've edited on John Paul the Great, which we can talk about in a minute. I'm just kind of getting the interest of the audience here. But before we get there, let's remind them of your journey to the church. You talked about it when we did our full interview. Most people, when they think about former Anglican clergy, they would presume you're brought up Anglican.
Well, I was really not brought up with anything. My parents sent me to a very Protestant boarding school, which gave me a version of Christianity which was so dour and so lacking in any kind of warmth that it turned me into a teenage atheist. And it really wasn't until after I was 30 that I began to think that there was something in Christianity, at least. And that was kind of almost by accident. I mean, I'd married my wife in church. In England, you can't just marry in all these places you can marry in this country. I mean, you can't marry while you're hang gliding or anything of that kind. Either you have to be in a church or you have to be in a designated office called a registry office, and you have to be married by the official registrar. So those are the only places. At least those were the only places then. It's been widened out since.
Changed, yeah.
One of the various tinkerings with English life that Tony Blair has carried out. However, let's not
delve into that.
Let's not delve into that. And we wanted basically we just started looking for the right kind of church, architecturally the right size. We wanted not too big a wedding, not too small. So we drove around country churches near my wife's childhood home, and we found a church my wife had always been very fond of, a beautiful church, 800 years old. And there's something about a building in which people have been praying for 800 years, which simply gets under your skin somehow. And we were married there. It was a very happy experience. So we began to go to church there whenever we were in the country. We never went to the church unless we were there. That was the only church we went to. But bit by bit,
drawn more by the ambiance and the architecture and the feel and the history.
But also the clergyman there, who was a former army chaplain, and who had a wonderful way with him. You know, it was somebody you could take seriously. He was a kind of the best kind of Anglican clergyman, somebody with his roots deep into the local community. The thing about an established church like that is, or the ancient church of the country, which it is, although it lost its roots, its Catholic roots at the Reformation. The parson, which is how he's known. The parson is an important man in the village, and whenever there was a fight in the local pub on a Saturday night because people were drunk and things got disorderly, they didn't send for the police. They sent for the parson to sort them out. He quietened the riot. Banged their heads together.
Because he knew guys on both sides, right?
Yeah, that's right. But bit by bit, we began to see there was something in this. And in the end, we both became members of the Church of England. And it became, having really been brought up as an atheist and suddenly becoming a practicing Christian, after 30, at the age of 30, it's a bit like one of these childhood diseases. If you catch it in childhood, it's not too bad, but as an adult, you get it big. So I immediately conceived a vocation to the Anglican priesthood. And 3 years later, I began my training in Oxford, which has been a place which has been very important to me ever since. And 2 or 3 years later, I became an Anglican priest.
And served there at Oxford, right?
Not immediately. I was a curate in a parish. And then, again, one of these extraordinary pieces of good fortune, I became the Bishop of Oxford's chaplain to postgraduate students in Oxford University, where I spent 5 very happy years, became a fellow of one of the colleges. Then after that, you couldn't imagine a bigger contrast to this very beautiful ancient town. I went to one of the roughest most working class parishes in England, probably, in a place called Romford in Essex, which is a very rough place. My car insurance immediately went right up.
Then had you thought about the Catholic Church during that aspect of your journey? Was that
it was.
sudden
I think it was always pretty clear to me that the Catholic Church was the real game in town. I mean, I believed, in fact, when I first became an Anglican. I became an Anglican because I thought that I was joining the ancient church of the country. I very quickly came across Anglican priests who told me, well, that is true, but something pretty fundamental happened to it. And you have to keep an eye on Rome if you want to be pretty sure that you're not going to go astray. I mean, for instance, the priest at our Anglican parish in London, to whom I went and said, I think I have a vocation to the priesthood, said, okay, and started recommending some books. He said, there's a general rule, he said, in theology. Don't read anything unless it's got the imprimatur. Okay, now this is an Anglican priest.
Do Anglicans give imprimaturs?
Yeah. No.
I want to make sure our audience understands
the Catholic imprimatur.
See, I mean, that's right. That's the slant there. Yeah.
That's right. You read Catholic theology, otherwise, he said, otherwise you might go to hell. Now this is, I mean, and I suddenly realized, I came across for the first time in that priest. I was kind of vaguely high church, vaguely sort of in that way inclined. I hadn't come across anything quite so hardline as this. He arrived, in fact, when we'd been living in London for a couple of years and been going to this parish, and we were told there was a new priest there. So we thought we very rarely went to church in London at all. We didn't like the kind of religion we got there. We liked religion in the country. And we thought it was a thing for the countryside, these ancient churches and so on. So we thought, well, we better support this man. And on his first Sunday, he said, from tomorrow on, there will be a daily mass. And I want somebody there. Don't let me go to the altar alone, ever. So we thought, right, we'll do that. So we started to go every day. And we were very surprised when on the first day, the first day turned out to be the feast of St. Maria Goretti, who is not an Anglican saint in 100 years. So my wife and I looked at each other and said, something's going on here. And indeed, it was a kind of classic operation, classic Anglo-Catholic operation. in that what has happened all over England is that an Anglo-Catholic priest has arrived in a non-Anglo-Catholic parish and has quietly, bit by bit, preached and installed Catholic devotions of various kinds. And after 2 or 3 years, you would suppose that it was a Roman Catholic church. One of the effects in this particular church was that every so often a member of his congregation said, "I'm sorry, Father, I can't stay in the Church of England any longer. I've got to become a Catholic." So he said, "Okay." He would phone up the local Catholic priest, said, "I'm sending another one to you." And at their reception, the parish would go round to wish them Godspeed. I thought, this is all amazing stuff. Anyway, the other thing was that he insisted I go to a particular Anglican seminary, St. Stephen's House in Oxford, which had very much a papalist, that was the word we used, a papalist Anglo-Catholic agenda. And basically we thought, we regarded ourselves as kind of shock troops of the Anglican counter-reformation. We were going to hand back the stolen property. You know, maybe we wouldn't get there in our lifetime. Maybe we would.
Toward it, yeah. What was the final? I mean, so if you're working in that gives the impression that really you're going to remain as a part of the team, Anglican team, until the whole Anglican team unites. And there are a lot of people that feel that way.
We all go together. And of course, you see, when Pope John Paul came to England and was such a huge, just a huge success, everybody was wondering, because this is a very anti-Catholic country, how this was going to come off. Well, he was an absolute, he wowed everybody. And when we saw him walking side by side with Robert Runcie, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican communion throughout the world, side by side in Canterbury Cathedral, which is the first cathedral in England, in the most ancient cathedral in England, the first place to be Christianized. And they both knelt together at the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. We all said to each other, it could happen in our lifetime now. Yeah. We're getting close. Everything we've worked for could happen a lot sooner than we think. And then, suddenly, the movement for the ordination of women really got underway. And it gathered momentum startlingly fast. And we suddenly realized that sooner or later it's bound to happen. It happened here in America. There were even women bishops after a time in America. We thought, well, how long will we hold out? How long can we hold this thing off? Well, the real thing was that the decision had to be made by a body called the General Synod of the Church of England. And what we were all fighting for was to stop this getting through in the General Synod. But it suddenly occurred to me that we had all accepted a scenario in which the General Synod actually did have the decision. That we didn't, as we had supposed, and the Church of England had always claimed, have the ministry, the threefold ministry of bishop, priest, and deacon of the universal church, inherited from the Catholic past, because we still had a Catholic present, and this was the continuous ministry that we believed we had the apostolic succession going right back to the beginning. But here was the Church of England taking to itself powers to decide this matter, which the Pope had told us he didn't have. We had been told by the Pope that he had no authority to ordain women. We were saying that we did. Now, it seemed to me that that was the Church of England defining itself in a way that I hadn't heard before. And the thing was that all us Anglican Catholics who were fighting it, or a huge number of them, had accepted that scenario. Now, many of them didn't, of course, and when women were ordained, they left in large numbers, and many of them became Catholics and Catholic priests. But I left before the decision was made, because I thought that all authority had now gone, that any notion that the Church of England, this branch theory, that the Church has three branches, the Roman, the Greek, and the English, that was all nonsense. That if you cut a branch off a tree, it stops growing. The leaves wither. And that's what had happened.
Now, that really sounds very similar to Bishop Graham Leonard's same reasoning in many ways. I mean, so my thinking is that, I mean, there were many of you that were very cognizant of not just the issue of whether women should be ordained or not, but who had the authority to decide that. I mean, that was really the issue.
In the end, it was the question of authority.
Yeah.
And we looked around, and I mean, another aspect of the whole thing was, I remember Archbishop Michael Ramsey of Canterbury, a good and holy man, very much of the Catholic tradition within Anglicanism, though I think probably a bit less hardline than our bunch was. But I remember him preaching after he'd long ceased. I think he was getting quite an old man. I think it may even have been the last sermon he ever preached. He died within a few months at Pusey House in Oxford, where I was attached, to which I was attached as a priest. And I remember him saying, "People come to me to say, 'Oh, Archbishop, what are we going to do to save the Church of England?' And I answer, 'I don't want a church I've got to save. I want a church that'll save me.'" And I thought of course he never did become a Catholic, but I thought that's a very good reason for not staying in the Church of England. A church I have to save.
That's very interesting. I was reading when I was in England last time a history of the English Civil War.
Yeah.
Which we Americans don't know very much about at all. I mean, we were distracted because Plymouth had already happened over here, so all of our attention came on this side of the pond. But I remember during that, some of the main characters, of course, were George I and his Catholic wife and her influence. But there was also that Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. Yeah. But the Archbishop at the time was very Anglo-Catholic.
Archbishop Laud.
Yes.
Yes.
Isn't that true? That what that to me pointed out is that whenever this Anglo-Catholic head started to rise, often many now in the Church of England fought against it really hard.
Oh yeah. They just thought the next thing we're going to be back to Rome again. You see, there had been such a massive anti-Catholic spin operation. The culture had really been got to, but it took generations. Mm-hmm. There were various big mistakes that Catholics made over the years. One big mistake was when the Pope excommunicated the Queen and said that, and released Catholics from their obedience to her, and said that any attempt to kill her would not be sinful. Now that was absolutely asking for Catholic persecution. Because immediately the Pope had announced that Catholics were a disloyal part of the population who could not be trusted, who had been released from their obedience to the Queen and encouraged to kill her. Now, what good was that going to do for any hope of reconciling?
And that did bring out a whole slew of persecutions and guys going out. And in fact, I think even we talked a little earlier about Shakespeare. Some of his family were caught up in those searching outs of people now were implied in being in different plots to kill the Queen. I think one was involved even with the gunpowder plot to some extent.
No, that's right. I mean, well, of course, Shakespeare's parents were both recusant Catholics, which means that they refused to go to church and had to pay the fine for it. Right. However, that's a whole other
Would
subject.
You see that today, do you think?
What?
If more and more Anglicans show their interest in the Catholic Church, especially if any of the Anglican bishops, I mean, you've got Graham Leonard, leaving. Yeah. Are you going to? Is it a different world in England today in its response to the possibility of an increase of the Catholic Church in England?
Oh yes. I mean, partly because, for various reasons, Catholics are now thought to be harmless. which isn't necessarily such a good thing. I mean, I think Catholic ought to be thought of as rather dangerous myself. I mean, we're subversives in a secular culture.
It's not a good commentary, is it? If we're considered
it isn't. No, I mean, I think that, you know, under Cardinal Basil Hume, the Catholic religion became respectable, and it was generally thought to be a great achievement of his. You know, the Queen called the Cardinal Hume "my cardinal." Now, a lot of us thought, hey, you know, we love the Queen, and indeed, all Catholics today are absolutely 100% loyal. But
well, there's a lot of countries in the world that if the ruler of the country called the local cardinal "my cardinal," that would not be a good thing at all.
Sure, yeah.
You know, and you know, that sadly gives a. I mean, we in EWTN know great faithful Catholics that have been on EWTN, and we're associated with them. But
you see, there was always an idea about Catholics. Just be careful with Catholics; they might want to try and convert you. You know, they're tricky. They're tricky devils. They try and sneak you in, especially Jesuits. You know, Jesuits have given up converting people in England now. I don't know what they do here, but it's thought to be under Cardinal Hume somehow it became bad manners to convert people. You know, the conversion was a kind of tasteless word. Yeah. It implied that you were right and they were wrong.
Well, that would be a misinterpretation of what the Second Vatican Council called us to do.
100% wrong. I mean, all the documents say, you know, that the full truth subsists only within the Catholic Church, but others have part of it. We have to pay attention to that. And that, of course, is all true.
To tell them the fullness. We have an email. We've got a few, Dr. Oddie. Let's try. This comes from Sylvia from Louisiana. Dear Marcus and Dr. Oddie, I have been to England and read many accounts of Henry VIII and how he defied the Holy Father, thereby breaking with Rome and making himself head of the church in England, thus forming the Anglican Church. Anglicans, I assume, know the same history of their church. So how is it that they cannot see the historical truth of the Catholic Church founded by Christ and still remain Anglican, knowing it began with Henry? Thank you. Love your show.
Because I, as an Anglican Catholic, did not accept that the Church of England began with Henry. After all, you know, we worshipped in the same churches. Our first bishops were the last Catholic bishops in England. And every bishop but one became an Anglican. The Church of England made a great deal of play about the continuity with the medieval church, and we could see the continuity. We worshipped in it. We worshipped in these glorious Catholic buildings, and the spirituality of these buildings was still there, and we were its heirs, if you like. So, quite simply, that was a version of history we didn't accept.
But you had a spin.
Well, basically, it wasn't just so much a spin. I mean, those of us who wanted to return the Church of England to her Catholic obedience, and I was one of those, and there were many of us, we believed, quite simply, we believed that, you know, those whom God has joined, no man can put asunder. We did not recognize the Reformation. You know, we consider ourselves as being, you know, as a sort of the shock troops, as I say, of the Anglican Counter-Reformation. That was what we were there for.
But the Pope, within your view, at that point in your time as an Anglican, you're considering yourself as a continuity of the ancient church.
Yeah.
But yet there was a break with the head of that church.
There was
How did you understand it back in those days?
There was by those in charge of the institution. That didn't alter my view that I was a true priest, and I believed myself to be a Catholic priest. It may seem funny to you, but we really believed that, and I accepted the authority of the Pope, and I brought my children up that way. I mean, I sent my children to Catholic schools, and I remember when I took my daughter, my eldest daughter, to be interviewed by the headmistress of the local Catholic school, who was an Ursuline Mother Superior of the convent, and she said, "Well, of course," I said, "I want them given exactly the same religious instruction as the Catholic children." She said, "Well, of course, you see, I don't know. I mean, for instance, my dear, she's talking to Victoria, my daughter. Of course, there are one or two things different. For instance, now, who's the head of the Church of England? Expecting she'd say the Queen. So my daughter replied, well, the Pope, of course. So she said, oh, God bless the child.
That's great. We've got a call from Robert from Arkansas. Hello, Robert. What's your question for us?
Yes. Good evening, Marcus, and
Hello.
good evening, Dr. Oddie. I am interested in knowing what the Anglican Church's position is on the Holy Eucharist, especially in relation to our teaching according to the body and blood, soul and divinity, and the transubstantiation.
Thanks, Robert.
Well, the trouble is, you see, there's very little different way that you can't find out what the official position of the Church of England is on anything. You know, the Church of England, Anglicanism is like a kind of theme park. You decide which ride you want to go on. There are many Anglicans who believe that the bread and wine at the Eucharist is bread and wine and nothing more. The bread left over, and usually it isn't the kind of wafer bread that we use. They just use an ordinary sliced loaf.
Cut up into chunks.
And just cut it up into little chunks, and anything left over at the end they throw on the lawn for the birds to eat. At the other end of the spectrum, a priest I would believe absolutely fully in transubstantiation, in the full Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist. I believed that I was offering the sacrifice of the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Mass. That was my firm belief. In the middle, there were lots of Anglicans who liked to go to church on Sunday and didn't believe it really mattered very much what it was. So how do you tell what the official Anglican position is? Nobody knows.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I remember you told me when you were talking about your journey about that experience of yourself when you're holding the Eucharist up and asking yourself that question.
I found myself one day at the altar, and it is not an enviable position to be in, believe me. I mean, I've told you what I believed. I was standing there elevating the host, and I looked at the host, and I had a sudden chill to my heart. What if the Pope is right about that? I know he's right about everything else. And that was the point at which I suddenly realized I cannot know. And the only person I trust, the Pope, tells me that that is not the body of Christ, that I am not a priest. Why should I trust him on everything else but not on that?
I mean, it's such an important point because you have all this within a denomination, you have all these views, but it isn't us me as a pastor that decides what that is.
No. The thing is, in an Anglican church, in the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, it's the parish clergyman who is the Pope. And everybody knows very well that they're free to disagree with the vicar or the rector, and if they don't like what he says, they can just go to the next parish along and find somebody they like better. You know,
wasn't there a clarity in the articles?
Yes, but there were different ways of explaining the articles. John Henry Newman, of all people, wrote an article, wrote a tract 90. That's why they were called Tractarians, after these tracts, which were designed to re-Catholicize Anglicanism. He wrote Tract 90 was to demonstrate that you could read the 39 articles in a Catholic sense.
Which got him in trouble. I mean, that was the tract, right?
Which got him into huge trouble.
Yep.
And it was practically the only thing he ever wrote, which was pretty silly. And of course, he accepted that later. But he did realize that if he was going to stay in the Church of England, he had somehow to prove it. He had somehow to demonstrate that. Otherwise, all the rest of the tracts were simply had no kind of authority at all.
Now, walking in his footsteps there at Oxford, did it have an influence on you personally? Newman's.
Newman, I think Newman has probably had a big influence on nearly every Anglican priest who becomes a Catholic. Because, he is, flesh of our flesh.
Yeah.
And after all, his writings were part of our tradition. His pre-Catholic writings, his Tractarian writings were part of our whole theological tradition. So he was part of us. And especially the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is in fact is a text I have had the honor of editing for one of the big paperback publishing companies in England, the Everyman Paperback.
Is it a newer edition of it?
No, it's about 10 years old now.
Okay, I think I read the older
15 years old now.
I had to get that, yeah.
And it's got lots of notes and things and everything else. And I spent a lot of my life on that book, during which I earned not a penny. It cost me a lot of money to write, to do it. But you don't get asked to do a thing like that and say no, But anyway, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, written from the point of view of an Anglican priest who suddenly realizes that the church he's a member of is not part of the Catholic Church, has had a big effect on a lot of English Anglicans, much less on Episcopalians who become Catholic. There are far fewer of those anyway. Yeah. It's always been, becoming a Catholic has always been far more on the agenda in the Church of England, precisely because of all its tradition. So I remember very well that before I became a Catholic, I went to see a priest who himself had converted, who in the end received me into the church. And he gave me some advice. First of all, he said, "You're a journalist. You better go and get vetted by a good Jesuit to make sure you're okay." So he found a good Jesuit. That's easier said than done. But he found me one who had a good look at me and said, "Yes, that sounds that sounds all right." And the other thing he said you must do is tell all your friends, go around one by one and explain what you're doing before you do it. Otherwise you'll cause huge offense to a lot of people who themselves believe they're Anglo-Catholics and believe that you're telling them that their orders are invalid and that they're not priests and that all their ministry is a mockery.
Be like a slap.
Of course, that's not what that's not what I meant to say at all, and I would never dream of saying such a thing or implying it. However, it was good advice. But I went to see my old principal at Pusey House, under whom I'd served when I was chaplain to graduates in Oxford University. I told him what I was going to do. So after a time he says, "Well, I could see it coming." And then he said, change the subject. "Have you been reading any good books lately?" So I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I've just finished reading the Apologia." I said, "Have you read it lately?" He said, "Oh, no," he said. "You're not going to get me that way. I'm not going to read that book until I'm well retired."
There you go. When we take a break, we'll come back just a moment with your questions for Dr. Oddie. See you. Welcome back to the Journey Home. We're here tonight with Dr. William Oddie, and we've got a couple calls and emails. Maybe before we get to those, I want to make sure that I mention your books. You've just mentioned the editing of the
Apologia Pro Vita Sua.
Yes, I want to make sure I mention that because I want a good copy of it.
Yeah.
I mentioned during the break that when I read it, I was still a Protestant on the journey and I was excited about it, but there was no translation in the book of the Latin phrases, which often were the key point of an entire chapter.
Because people expected that any educated man would have Latin.
Back then.
Back then, yeah.
But you've corrected that for the new version and added the translations, which is great.
Well, I simply got, notes of all the, you have to do that. Yeah.
But there's two other books I wanted to make sure we mentioned, one of which is available on the Religious Catalog, and that's a book about John Paul.
Yeah. That was a book that was put together for the late Holy Father's 25th anniversary as Pope. And it originated with a conference that was held in Oxford, to which I gave the keynote address on the Pope's ministry. My address was called John Paul the Great, and which wasn't, people weren't using that much in those days. That was some time ago. That was, sort of, I think, about 2000, 2001. When I became editor of the Catholic Herald, which is the probably the most influential Catholic newspaper in England, weekly newspaper, I thought I'm going to have one or two little campaigns here, and one of those was to make that phrase, that expression, the description of the Pope, John Paul the Great, more commonly used. So I sneaked that into editorials whenever I could. And when I came to write this address, I thought, well, it would be an awfully good thing to get some of the other contributors to this conference here, together with other people, talking about various aspects of the Pope's ministry. But I first of all wanted to argue the parallel with the other two popes who are called the Great. And there's some quite close parallels, I think, in many ways. I think this is a serious thing, and I think when he is canonized, I think that will happen, and I hope it'll be officially declared. But if you compare them, say, with Pope Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great didn't simply re-establish the authority of the Bishop of Rome over the Church in doctrinal matters, which the late Pope did. He also had, all three of them had a great geopolitical influence. And in the case of Pope Gregory, Attila the Hun was coming south in Italy, and Pope Gregory went north to meet him, and he persuaded him that it wouldn't be worth his while coming any further south, and not to come any further. Now, there's all kinds of argument about how he did that, but it is absolutely certain that after their meeting, Attila went north. Now, I think the parallel there is in a letter the late Holy Father wrote to Brezhnev, who had the Red Army drawn up to the Polish border. You remember those extraordinary days when the Pope went to Poland and galvanized the country and completely reawoke the Catholic culture of that country and made it basically ungovernable. And Brezhnev thought, as Khrushchev before him, that it was time now to sort out Poland as Hungary had been sorted out and Czechoslovakia had been sorted out by the Red Army. And the Pope wrote him a letter pointing out that Poland was not like Czechoslovakia. It was very, we have the text of this letter now. It's been released, since the fall of the Soviet Union. We have the text. Very diplomatic, but he makes it clear that you're not going to have an easy time like you did in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Poland is Poland, and it's gone too far. You would be unwise to go any further. And about 2 weeks after that letter was sent, the Red Army withdrew from the border. Now, I think that's very like Pope Gregory and Attila the Hun.
What was the name of this book again?
The book is simply called John Paul the Great.
All right. And then we'll say that the other authors also are well known to EWTN, Aidan Nichols,
Ian Carr, Aidan Nichols, John Saywood. And various others, all talking about one particular aspect. Aidan Nichols on the encyclicals, Ian Carr on the Pope's encouragement for the new movements, and so on.
All right. Fine book. Then the other book, we've got some. Let's take another caller, then we'll get to the other book. This is Joe from New York. Hello, Joe. What's your question? Hello, Joe. Are you there? Did I surprise you? Okay, we'll get him in a second. The other reason you're here in America right now is because you're at this Chesterton conference because you've got a book on Chesterton coming out.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Title for that is?
The title is Chesterton and the Romance of Orthodoxy, which is one of the chapter headings in his book Orthodoxy, which he published in 1908. So it's the centenary of the publication of that very important book. And this entire conference was about this one book.
All right. Let's see. We've got an email from Matt from Indiana. Dear Dr. Oddie, do you see more Anglicans turning to the Catholic Church? Thank you.
I think it's inevitable, yes. I mean, certainly in the Church of England, what you have now is a kind of church within a church. It's even defined itself, it's given itself a name. It's those who are opposed to women's ordination. They call themselves forward in faith. And they've quite simply declared themselves out of communion with any Anglican bishop who ordains women, with all the women they ordain, and with any other priest who's ordained by those bishops. And they have been granted their own bishops. That was a way of stopping them leaving entirely, who ordain all their priests. So they're kind of almost a ready-made breakaway group there. Now, I think that the minute women are ordained as bishops in the Church of England, you're going to get a big breakthrough. And what they want to do is break away as a block. And I know they're talking to Rome, and I think I know some of what they're saying, but I better not say what they're saying. But I mean, I do know, for instance, their general plan is to regularize their orders, to have themselves reordained they're in conversation with the Polish Catholic Church in this country, which is a breakaway church itself, but I think the official term is in a path of convergence with Rome. So they'll get Catholic orders. They will then declare that their faith is that of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Then they will go to Rome and say, "Here we are. What are you going to do with us?"
All right. And you mentioned women's ordination, but there are all those other issues which all of us are familiar with from watching the media that really are. It's just an escalation.
Well, it's gone a lot
an
further
avalanche.
than that
It's just going, and how are you ever going to stop it?
It isn't just you've got homosexual priests. I mean, you actually got homosexual bishops who are ordained as such. In other words, these are not priests who are inclined towards homosexuality, but who believe in the authority of Scripture and whatever church they belong to. These are people who believe absolutely that there's nothing inconsistent between homosexual practice, and the Christian religion. Yeah. And I think that, once a church becomes so comprehensive that it includes that view as well as including people who believe it is a sin against God, then it's lost so much definition that you wonder if you've actually even got a church left anymore. What kind of organization is this? It's hard to, Anglicanism, of course, has always been undefined, as I said earlier. Yeah. You've got at least 3 different kinds of Anglicans, but now, with the total collapse of any kind of moral theology, you're in real trouble.
And basically, the underlying thing here is that really God says anything I want God to say.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's really it. God says whatever
right.
I want him to say, and so you've made yourself God.
Yeah.
And so you have a religion when really you're the God.
Yeah. But I mean, this is one of the fundamental. This is one of the fundamental theological principles of liberal Protestantism, that God is a projection that we have made from ourselves. And once God becomes that, we are gods. We have made ourselves gods.
I think Joe's back. Hello, Joe, New York.
Marcus, I got cut off before. I was wondering, of your guest, did the Blessed Virgin Mother or any of the saints influence him to be converted?
Did who, sorry?
The Blessed Virgin Mother or any of the saints. Thank you, Joe.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that Anglican Catholics have a very great reverence for the Blessed Virgin. Remember our parish in London, which is a very working-class Cockney parish. I remember, who always referred to the Blessed Virgin as Mum. And they would kneel, I remember, very devoutly in front of the tabernacle, which they called Sir. You know, which is, these were not meant to be irreverent titles at all, but I mean, on Mother's Day, you should have seen the pile of flowers in front of the statue of Our Lady. And they had a very touching and very beautiful reverence for Our Lady.
All right. Email from Michael in St. Augustine, Florida. Dear Dr. Oddie, I am wondering, at what point did you discover the early church fathers, and what role did they play in your journey?
Well, the early church fathers, of course, have always been accepted by the Church of England. You know, that was always part of the Anglican tradition, even by Anglicans who don't regard themselves as particularly Catholic. I mean, we basically believe that we believe what the undivided Church believed. What we didn't accept was anything that had happened after the Reformation. So, though that having been said, that was one of the things that Newman himself achieved. Mm-hmm. The fathers were rather lost from sight of in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and it was Newman's writings on the fathers which brought Anglicanism back into, as it were, the patristic orbit. And I think that to this day there are very fine patristic scholars in the mainstream Church of England.
I think it was Newman that in his writing, maybe it was when he did the book on the Arian heresy, that he came to the personal conclusion that when he studied, every time he studied the heresies, he had to admit that he would always have to end up on the side of the heretic.
Yeah.
Wasn't he talking about...
As an Anglican, yes.
As an Anglican.
As an Anglican, yes.
That was the struggle.
Yes, yes.
Trying to find the middle road, but yet he would be on the side of the heretic.
I think the way he put it was, I looked at myself in the mirror and I saw a monophysite.
Whatever that looks like. All right. We've got a call from Ann from California. Hello, Ann. What's your question?
Yes, good evening. My question is, C.S. Lewis greatly admired and was influenced by G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you know if he ever considered becoming a Catholic convert as Chesterton did? Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
I believe that he didn't. But I think he believed so many Catholic things. I mean, he wrote a very good essay about why women would never be ordained as priests in the Church of England, for instance.
Yeah.
And he went to confession every week, which a lot of Catholics don't.
So it's not an Anglican habit.
It is not. Well, I mean, that we did. I mean, Anglo-Catholics did.
Right.
But he didn't really consider himself to be an Anglo-Catholic. I mean, actually, I have a story about C.S. Lewis's Catholicism, or whether or not he would have been, which is that his former secretary, Walter Hooper, who was a friend of mine, told me that he considered that C.S. Lewis had become a Catholic posthumously. I said, how do you make that up, Walter? He said, well, because when I was an Anglican, I always arranged for a Requiem Mass to be said on the anniversary of his death. But when I became a Catholic, I took the Requiem Mass over to the Catholic Church that we both go to, in fact. So I reckon that was the point at which he became a Catholic, and I was his sponsor. He said. But I think that it's a good question. My view is that had he lived, and he died young, to see women's ordination, I think he would have become a Catholic.
Yeah, and all the other things that, I mean, the same things that you and Bishop Leonard saw were the issue of authority. I mean, C.S. Lewis would have seen that, and he, I think so too. I think in the trajectory of, because he wasn't just throwing out his opinions when he wrote his books, he was throwing out what he believed was authentic truth.
Yes. And the interesting thing is about him is that the book of Chesterton's that most influenced him wasn't orthodoxy, which Chesterton wrote as an Anglican, of course. It was The Everlasting Man, which was one of the early books he wrote as a Catholic.
All right. Let's take our next caller, Lewis from Texas. Hello, Lewis. What's your question?
Oh, thank you, Dr.
Lois.
Oddie, for your example. We were with you in Fort Worth in 1989 with Graham Leonard, and you all went back to England and became Roman Catholic, and my husband and I wandered in the desert for about 10 years and found Our Lady of Walsingham and are so blessed. We have the Anglican youth, Roman Catholic Church, and
Where's that?
we just thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I was wondering which parish that was of the Anglican youth.
Our Lady of Walsingham
Oh, right. And where is that?
in Houston.
Houston. Okay, right. Well, I remember that conference very well in Fort Worth. It took place in a huge, great Baptist church because it was the only place big enough. And that was one of the sort of, that was when, you know, the whole fight back was still going on against all this stuff.
You were still Anglican at the time.
I was still an Anglican at the time,
Yeah.
but I came over for that conference because we thought that was very important, and I was one of the speakers at it. And that's right, Bishop Lennon was there, and a lot of other people were there too. And that was a great time of hope. We thought maybe we're getting somewhere now, but it all collapsed.
The Anglican use that she mentions, to what extent has that taken place in England itself?
That hasn't happened at all in England.
Really?
I had very much hoped that it would be established, because in England it had a chance of really getting off the ground. It has never really got off the ground in the States. I mean, I think there are sort of 20 parishes, maybe a handful anyway,
Right.
compared with how many there could be. But in England, there was, I think, always had more possibility, because, you know, becoming a Catholic has always been more on the agenda for Anglicans in England than it ever has here among Episcopalians. And I think that a lot of parishes could have come over. Like 2 did, only 2. And I wrote about both these parishes in a book I wrote called The Roman Option, about this whole thing. And the book came out on Tuesday. I described everything that had happened. It was condemned by the Catholic bishops on the Thursday. And those 2 parishes are closed down on Saturday.
You're kidding. That's... So what you discussed in that book was the frustration that you had all these, as you mentioned earlier in the program, all these Anglican priests, as many as 900, right? Wasn't that right?
Left the Church of England.
And
not all became priests, but 300 or 400 of them did.
okay, but the part that you saw as the biggest disappointment was that there had been very little encouragement for those Anglican priests to encourage their congregations.
Who wanted to come over with their people.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You know, it would have been a fantastic way of kind of floating them off on a kind of rescue barge. Now, you know, those parishes wouldn't have, you know, people move, they move around the country. That would have been a way of getting them over, you know. It would have been a pastoral thing to have done. But a lot of the Catholic bishops thought, we don't want too many of these old-fashioned pre-Vatican II Anglicans. They thought of them in that way. And basically, I think a lot of them thought they were just a bit too keen on the Pope.
You don't want to make too big of waves when you live on an island, right?
No.
Now, what about 10 years later now? You think that given how much has changed in the Anglican Church that you're going to see groups, and will the hierarchy be a little more open to it?
Well, no. The hierarchy won't. But I think these people, this time, these people this time won't talk to the hierarchy. They'll talk to Rome.
All right.
And we'll hope that some kind of parallel jurisdiction will be allowed them.
And really, you're seeing this not as a possibility, but this is probably going to happen sometime, because the trajectory of what's going probably happen at Lambeth soon is
there will be women bishops. After all, you know, once a church accepted that women can be priests, what kind of sense does it make not to allow them to be bishops? Yeah. Which is what they decided. It's kind of theologically crazy. But of course, it's all politics. They hoped that if they did that, they could keep these people on board. And for the time being, they did. With all kinds of concessions, like giving them their own bishops and so on. But once a woman is bishop, especially once she's diocesan bishop, you've got a whole new ball game.
And
so I think that many will come.
And that decision is facing us here soon when they gather, either this year or next. Dr. Oddie, thank you very much for joining us again on the journey home, and it's a pleasure being with you. Thank you for your wisdom and your writing. I really appreciate that very much. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the Journey Home. God bless you. See you again next week.